The book we're covering today has two titles. It's called either The English in the West Indies or The Bow of Ulysses. It's nonfiction, and it follows James Anthony Froude traveling through the West Indies in the late 1880s. As he travels from Barbados to Grenada to Haiti to Cuba, he talks about the current state of the islands, the history of each island, and his general thoughts on politics and history. It's an interesting read from a historical perspective, and if you want a sort of slice-of-life depiction of what it was like in the late 1880s, I'd highly recommend the book for that alone. We're mostly going to be covering the ideas because that's what this channel's about. I wanted to cover the book because it's listed in a few places as a book in the neo-reaction canon, and after reading it, I can definitely see why. I can see the lines of influence. Hopefully after this series, you'll be able to as well. We'll start with the alternative title of the book, The Bow of Ulysses. So that title, The Bow of Ulysses, is first introduced in the second chapter. Remember, Froude is writing in the 1880s at the height of the British Empire, or maybe a little bit before the height. They still have control of India and a bunch of regions over there. They have pieces of Africa. They still have Canada and the Caribbean and a lot more. Froude saw that the English were losing their will to rule, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before things fell apart. To some degree, that's what the whole book is about. In Chapter 2, he writes about the fact that the English are letting control of the Caribbean slip through their fingers, and he's trying to explain why. He writes, quote, "I do not believe in the degeneracy of our race. I believe the present generation of Englishmen to be capable of all that their fathers were, and possibly of more. But we are just now in a molting state, and are sick while the process is going on. Or to take another metaphor, the bow of Ulysses is unstrung. The worms have not eaten into the horn, or the moths injured the string, but the owner of the house is away, and the suitors of Penelope Britannia consume her substance. Rivals one of another, each caring only for himself, but with a common heart in evil. They cannot string the bow. Only the true lord and master can string it, and in due time he comes, and the cord is stretched once more upon the notch, singing to the touch of the finger with the sharp note of the swallow, and the arrows fly to their mark in the breasts of the pretenders, while Pallas Athene looks on approvingly from her coign of vantage." So it's not that the British had lost something innate. Their power and dominance was still there. They just had to seize it. The important thing was to cut through the multicultural, liberal, equality nonsense that was taking over the British mind back then. Unfortunately, they weren't able to do it. They lost their will to rule, and basically they lost control of the world. The situation really reminds me of our current situation, and specifically it reminds me of the way that Richard Spencer talks about the struggle of whites all over the world today. The way he talks about it, his goal isn't to take power or anything like that. His goal is to raise consciousness to the point where whites actually want to take power. Once whites know what they want, taking the power is the easy part. Froude didn't doubt that if the English wanted to retain control, they could. He was just afraid that they would lose the will to do it. He wrote that the English living in Barbados, Grenada, and the rest of the Caribbean asked for closer ties with Britain, but the British didn't seem to care. Quote, "It seemed that their masters in Downing Street answered them as the Romans answered their forefathers. We have many colonies, and we shall not miss Britain. Britain is far off and must take care of herself. She brings us responsibility, and she brings us no revenue. We cannot tax Italy for the sake of Britons. Let them do now what they can or please." Virtually, this is what England says to the West Indies. The answer from Rome, we can now see, was the voice of dying greatness, which was no longer worthy of the place in the world which it had made for itself in the days of its strength. But it doubtless seemed reasonable enough at the time. And now in the current year, we can see that he was right. It was dying greatness that made the British feel that way. Britain isn't really even on the world stage anymore the way it was back then, and it fell from the world stage much more quickly than Rome did. The English lost their will, and when they couldn't see how their empire directly benefited them in that moment, they just let it fall away. It's sort of a tragic situation, and I think it's a lot like the situation the alt-right is in today. We see that we're on a downward slope, and that our society is trying to destroy everything our ancestors worked for. And we also see that no one seems to care, and the elites of the society, the people who should be guiding our nations forward, are the ones that are working the hardest to destroy them. Froude has some guidance from the past on what he thinks cause empires to rise and fall. Quote, "The men who make empires are the men who can hold them together. Oratorical reformers can overthrow what deserves to be overthrown. Institutions, even the best of them, wear out and must give place to others. And the fine political speakers are the instruments of their overthrow. But the fine speakers produce nothing of their own, and as constructive statesmen, their paths are strewed with failures. The worthies of England are the men who cleared and tilled her fields, formed her laws, built her colleges and cathedrals, founded her colonies, fought her battles, covered the oceans with commerce, and spread our race over the planet to leave a mark upon it which time will not efface." He's setting up this dichotomy between men of action and men of words. He goes on at length about how he thinks that these empires throughout time were overthrown from within by orators. Fascism under Mussolini had an emphasis on action and men of action as opposed to intellectuals, and I can see sort of a parallel there. Also, the quote really reminds me of the neo-reaction mindset. One major difference between the neo-reaction guys and the rest of the alt-right is that generally, the alt-right is out there trying to convert people. The neo-reaction guys aren't as explicitly trying to convert. They're trying to build institutions that they trust people will flock to when the current system falls. They're men of action. On the other hand, some alt-right guy with a YouTube channel wouldn't be. Froude saw the collapse of the British Empire coming, but there was another empire that had collapsed already, but had left its legacy in the Caribbean, and Froude had the opportunity to visit some of these Spanish-controlled islands and contrasted them with the British ones. When he was in Cuba, he wrote, quote, "The Spaniards, however inferior we may think them to ourselves, have filled their colonies with their own people, and are reaping the reward of it. Spain, 4 centuries ago, was the greatest of European nations, the first in art, or second only to Italy, the first in arms, the first in the men whom she produced. She has been swept along in the current of time. She fought against the stream of tendency, and the stream proved too strong for her, great as she was. The modern spirit, which she would not have when it came in the shape of the Reformation, has flowed over her borders as revolution, not to her benefit, for she is unable to assimilate the new ideas. The old Spain of the Inquisition is gone. The Spain of today is divided between liberalism and Catholic belief. She is sick in the process of the change, and neither she nor her colonies stand any longer in the front line in the race of civilization. Yet the print of her foot is stamped on the new world in characters, which will not be effaced, and may be found to be as enduring as our own. The really sad thing about a lot of the islands in the West Indies is that they had so many slaves, and the blacks had children at such a rate, that when the countries broke away from the English Empire, they ended up being black countries rather than white ones, and so all the whites had to leave. You have to remember that these countries didn't start out that way. Originally there were Caribs there, who were, basically like Native Americans, and they all died. So these places could have been white countries. Empires rise and fall, but demographics is destiny, and the fate of a country is determined by the sorts of people who live there. The British Empire may have lost the West Indies, and they may have lost the political will to control places like Australia and Canada, but both Australia and Canada, and also the US, are much closer culturally to Europe than Barbados will ever be, and that's all about demographics. I think Froude overlooked the amount of natives living in these Spanish-controlled countries. Places like Cuba and Venezuela might have more in common with Spain than Haiti does with France, but they still aren't very much to be proud of. When Froude wrote about Spain, he also dug into the history and legacy of Protestantism. For context, both Charles V and Philip II were Catholic rulers who fought against Protestant forces at one time or another. Charles for the Holy Roman Empire and Philip for Spain. Quote, "If Charles V and Philip II were to come back to this world and see whither the movement had brought us, of which they had worked so hard to suppress the beginning, they would still say that they had done right in trying to strangle it. The Reformation called itself a protest against lies, and the advocates of it imagined that when the lies, or what they called such, were cleared away, the pure metal of Christianity would remain unsullied. The great men who fought against the movement had seen that it could not rest there, that it was the cradle of a revolution in which the whole spiritual and political organization of Europe would be flung into the crucible. Under that organization, human nature had ascended to attitudes of chivalry, of self-sacrifice, which it had never before reached. The 16th century was the blossoming time of the Old World, and no such men had appeared since as then came to the front, either in Spain or Italy, or Germany or France or England. The actual leaders of the Reformation had been bred in the system which they destroyed. Puritanism and Calvinism produced men of powerful character, and now the liberty which was demanded had become a revolution which would tolerate no inequalities of culture or position, which insisted that no man was better than another, which was to exalt the low and bring down the high, till all mankind should stand upon a common level. A level not of baseness or badness, but a level of good-humored, smart, vulgar, and vulgarizing mediocrity, with melodrama for tragedy, farce for comedy, sounding speech for statesman-like wisdom, and for a creed, when our fathers thought that we had been made a little lower than the angels, the more modest knowledge that we were only a little higher than the apes." So that's quite a quote, and he's making some bold claims. Protestantism does have equality baked into it in a way that Catholicism doesn't. The emphasis on a person being capable of reading his own Bible, rather than going through the church in order to understand God's will, is a fundamentally democratic and equalizing idea. At the same time, you could argue that Christianity itself was an equalizing idea compared to the pagan religions that came before. I'm not a theologian, But I know Jesus was raised by a carpenter, lived in humble surroundings, and said stuff like, "It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." The reality of religion is that there's a lot to draw on, and depending on the culture of the people and the inclinations of the leaders, they can focus on one thing or another. Christianity can be a hierarchical crusading force for tradition, or it can be an equalizing, democratizing force for hedonism. But one of the more interesting bits of that quote for me is, quote, "The Reformation called itself a protest against lies, and the advocates of it imagined that when the lies, or what they called such, were cleared away, the pure metal of Christianity would remain unsullied." Because that's not what happened, of course. Before the church was attacked, it was seen as a divine institution on earth. Totally unquestionable. The debate wasn't over whether or not what the church did was bad. It was whether humans had the right and ability to question it. The reality of Protestantism is that it brought the church down to a human level. It was decided that humans could and should question the church. And then after that, forever, the church was stuck defending itself against anyone who might have a grievance. And look, I'm not going to apologize for some of the acts of the church. There were clearly some popes who were horrible people, if you look back at the history. But I think we should revisit the question of whether we want authority to be questionable at all. Say what you will about monarchy, but generally it was understood that there needed to be a monarch, that the monarch needed a claim, and that monarchy was the way to go. There were no other political options that were seriously considered. The ideal, from a stability perspective, would be a kingdom where everyone really believes the king is divine, and there is no possibility of anyone else becoming king afterward, except whoever that person chooses to be king. And that's what the neo-reaction guys want. The devil's advocate position, though, is that we live now in a world where democracy is considered the only reasonable form of government. And we have these global elites pushing for democracy everywhere. And that's very bad for the countries that are doing okay without democracies. But assuming this belief in the divine right of democracy stays around, and people have some faith in the institutions that handle the voting, there shouldn't be any violent revolutionaries pushing for monarchy or dictatorship or something else. Democracy might end up being more stable than monarchy. I think kind of the evidence is looking that way now for sure. And I'm not necessarily advocating for democracy here. I'm not a fan. At a very visceral level, I think democracy is a really stupid idea. But you have to give credit where it's due, and democracy has been a stabilizing force within a country when it comes to revolution. I would like to have a form of government where power is based on merit and ability, and on whether you're actually going to safeguard the civilization, rather than just giving power to everyone equally, or maybe the people best able to manipulate the masses. But the thing is, I don't know how to get from here to there. I don't want to enter a meat grinder, where everyone who has an idea for this utopian vision has an equal say, and so everybody is constantly drumming up for all these different revolutions. What do you guys think, seriously? Because that's where I'm going to leave it here for today. In the next video, we're going to talk about some of Froude's practical observations about the governance of the West Indies. It was an interesting time because democracy wasn't at all guaranteed, and there were debates about how much autonomy to give to these tiny islands with even tinier white minorities. See you guys next time.